Good evening, everyone. My name is Janet Cornish, and I'm on the Board of Directors of Community Culture and Heritage, which is the nonprofit organization that, in partnership with Butte Silver Local Government Archives and Historic Preservation Office, are managing the Butte Cultural Heritage Center, which is where we all are now, the historic Congregation B'nai Israel Synagogue. This effort over the last several years has brought all sorts of different programs, people, ethnicities, and I think our program tonight is going to be especially interesting, and we're looking forward to sharing these wonderful speakers with all of you. I'd first like to introduce the members of our group who are here tonight, the Community Culture and Heritage. Dave Canty in the back. Glenn Rayfish. Where's Glenn? Aubrey Japp, who is also the director of the Butte Silver Archives. Clayton, who is Butte Silver Historic Preservation Officer, is unable to join us tonight, but she's on our board as well. We also, before we get to our program, have a couple of special guests I would like to introduce all of you to. I have another hat, and that is as adjunct instructor at Montana Technological University in the writing program. And the writing program and the Department of Biology are hosting two young leaders from Southeast Asia. And these two leaders are both educators who are here through a special program through the United States State Department and the Mansfield Center at the University of Montana. And they are here they're winding their time down for about a month, and they've been visiting classes both at Montana Tech and in the public schools here, and really doing wonderful projects, and we're really proud to have them as our guests. So I'd like to introduce Josh from the Philippines and Akila from Malaysia. So the Butte Cultural Heritage Center, with the great guidance and suggestions from Father Patrick Beretta, we're talking about what we might do as a center in this time of unfortunate community conflict and polarization, particularly this time in the election season. And we thought, well, there might be something that Butte history, or our histories in general, can help us understand the culture of conflict and how might past conflicts help us to address and heal in a way that supports the whole sense of being members of a community, and where we celebrate our differences rather than let them divide us. In light of that, we've invited three speakers here tonight, and we're going to hear from each of them. And just very quickly, we have Clayton Elliott, who is the Conservation and Government Affairs Director for Montana's Trout Unlimited. Jim Keane, who served more than 2 decades as a state legislator, both in Montana's House and Senate. Jeremy Johnson, who is the Chair and Associate Professor of the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Carroll College. Also, we're honored to have Father Patrick Beretta serve as moderator for our group. I know many of you know Father Patrick. He is the parish priest in Butte, and he also serves as chaplain at Montana Tech and is chair of the Board of Trustees at Carroll College. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed
Janet, thank you for opening your beautiful, beautiful building to us. And thank you all for coming. It's truly a joy to be with you and an honor to be with you with this great panel to have a very thoughtful conversation this evening together. So, on the anniversary of 9/11, I was invited, as well as our sheriff, to share some remarks at the Butte Civic Center for a ceremony of remembrance. And I was really struck, the remarks were incredibly moving from all the speakers, but I was really struck that spontaneously, independently of each other, we all spent time evoking the exceptional spirit of togetherness that enveloped this country after 9/11. And all the speakers spoke about this togetherness with great nostalgia and great longing for something so precious that was the envy and the admiration of the entire world, and that has completely evaded us. It completely escaped us. It's something, unfortunately, that is over in this country. So tonight we're going to try to see, instead of just being victims to this new kind of circumstance of polarization, how we can have conversations to help us overcome it and be better prepared to navigate it. I have a great hero by the name of Father Alec Reed. During the most dark years of the Northern Ireland conflict, he had this great insight after having witnessed two unspeakable tragedies and massacres that took place at the conclusion of funerals. He said, if I can only bring people on each side of the divide, if I can bring people that are separated by this gulf that we have in Northern Ireland, I know if they speak to each other, I will be able to bring peace. He was successful in doing it because of amazing persistence, and most historians consider him to be the great architect of the Good Friday peace agreement. Conversation is important, and tonight we're hoping that we can model a way to have a conversation about very important topics that matter to all of us, as a way to heal our divisions, heal our wounds, and preserve the sacredness of community. So what to expect? The level of our conversation will be well above the partisan level. This is not going to be a debate. This is going to be a serious conversation. And then we're going to divide the evening into parts, separated by a brief break, where we first will listen to some presentation, and I will engage them after each presenter, and then I will open it up to the public for you to share some comments and ask us some questions. 3 topics: labor, conflicts in labor, conflicts related to ideology of politics, and conflict related to the environment, land, and stream access. All very important topics that matter to people very, very much in this state. And so I asked that the ladies from, or actually the members of the board, to pick by chance the order of presentation. They will all have 15 minutes each. We will engage them, and then we'll open it up to conversation. So our first presenter is Mr. Keane, who's going to address the topic of conflict in labor.
Thank you. Thank you, Father Beretta, and thank you for conflict. In order to get off on the right foot and avoid personal conflict, I want to make sure I introduce my wife, Dolores. To make my life a lot better this evening later. Thank you for coming to my Dolores. I would like to maybe start off to say we need to take about 1875, and then we need to think about 2024, roughly 150 years. In 1875, if we wanted to read a paper, we'd have to light a candle or get a lantern. Today, we We have lights here, we have lights outside, just 150 years later. If we wanted to send a message home when we were in Butte, Montana, we'd have to mail that letter, and it might take a month to get there and a month to get back. I could pull my cell phone out right now, walk outside, make a call to my daughter in Ireland, make a call to China, make a call anywhere, send a text in. That's 150 years. And in order to do this presentation, I got thinking about it. I'm 80 years old, and I see there's other friends out in the audience. I've lived over half of that 150 years. I've been alive through all this. For half of it. And if you think of the other half, my mother and my grandfather, who I communicated with, lived through the other half. So the radical change in human history in 150 years is what we need to think about. And my part of it is in Butte history, in the labor history of Butte. And the reason I picked 1875 is because in 1876, Daley was sent to Butte by the Walker brothers to look at the Alice mine. And Daley came to Butte, and why did the Walker brothers send Daley to Butte? And if you kind of just assume things, because in Salt Lake City they were building the railroad, it took them 8 years to build a railroad to Butte. So he came to Butte, he looks at Butte, develops the Alice mine, the railroad comes in about 81, gets into Butte. But what did Daley do in 1980? Sold his interest in the Alice and bought the Anaconda. And why did he buy the Anaconda? Because I think Daley understood that copper was going to be the new gold. And in order for that, Clark had been here a little prior to Daley, and the early days in Butte, unions were welcome. They could organize. They weren't handicapped. Why? Because Daley needed men, Clark needed men, major independents needed men. So everything was kind of settled until they start to have some strife amongst themselves. And they cut the wages, and then the men really figured out, well, we need to do something. And so numbers counted, and the unions kind of started winning. But the peace was there till about, it wasn't total peace, but the peace was there in labor in Butte till about 1900. And another event happened in 1899. Daley sold his interest to Standard Oil. I'm not a big fan of the oil companies, because that's when things changed. When Standard Oil came in, Daley was put as president of the Anaconda Company. Then what happened? 1 year later, Daley died. Same thing happened, came in again, and we go through the dark period of labor and the conflicts that led up through World War I. And that is the dark time of management was trying to get control, labor was fighting it out, and then we had, I think, one of the most interesting parts in history was when World War I came. World War I came to Butte. The Irish didn't want to be there on the English side. The Germans didn't want to be fighting. So this is when the real conflict started between 1914 and 1917. Is when they blew the hall up and did all those things in that period of time. And frankly, conflict was settled by what? Martial law. Butte has one of the most interesting things. We were under martial law from 1914 to 1921. In order to keep the mines running and settle all the disputes, we were under martial law. That's how the dispute was settled. Or it wasn't really settled, it was managed. Tensely enforced. So then we go through the next period for labor is we get through, what's the next big deal? Is the Depression. So my mother lived through Depression, and I think a lot of people that you knew lived through the Depression, and they brought that with them, And I think that after the Depression is when people realized they had to stick together to get some, and then Roosevelt came, and World War II was a total different thing, and the unions flourished, and the negotiations really were kind of instrumental in keeping things going. So the labor history ebbs and flows on by what happens by the policy of the company and the policy of the people who are working there. And I think in my labor history of Butte, that Butte has a unique history in the fact that the company, Janet Finn wrote a great book, if you want to read it, Trace the Vein. The Anaconda Company had Butte, and the Anaconda Company had Chuquicamata, two major copper mines in the world. And the old saying went, when Butte's doing good, and they were union in Chuquicamata too. When Butte's doing good, Chuqui's not doing too good. And when Chuqui's doing good, Butte's not doing good. Because they had these two mines, and then they just played them against, they negotiated the contract so they were offsetting. And what really finished the Anaconda Company off was when Chile nationalized Chuquicamata and took it away. Prices were low. Atlantic Richfield came in and picked up the pieces. We were all sitting in this community saying, oh, this is going to be great. Oil company's going to invest. And they would have made billions if they invested, but they didn't because copper was low. And they just said, we're shutting it down. And to me, the interesting part of the history of Butte is we came so close to having nothing here. And the mineralization of the hills would save us. It's in two different categories, but that's a story for another day. That labor history in my own life is I belong to unions, and when I grew up here, all those people out of the Depression area and the World War II guys came back and started business. They weren't opposed to unions. Everything was union here. So when I went to work, and I wrote them down so I didn't forget, I belonged to the laborers, the Teamsters, the Miners Union, the Baggage Handlers Union, the Brewery Workers Union. I spent a lot of time in the Boilermakers Union and the Operating Engineers Union. And I ended up, at my end of my career, I was the business manager for the Operating Engineers Union. And when you negotiate a contract and become the person who negotiates the contracts or has people negotiating a contract, you have to have a thick skin. Because the guys you negotiate the contract for, your members, are mad at you, you didn't get them enough money. The owners are mad at you, the guys you negotiate with, because you got too much. So no one is ever happy. Not everyone is happy in a negotiation. But when both people come up a way and you settle differences and you go back to work and everybody's happy, you know. One of my great statements when I negotiate, and I can't tell you how many contracts, when it clicks, when you sit, maybe you say, come on, I want to talk to you for a minute, to an owner, do you say, do you realize we're both losing money here? My members aren't getting anything, and you're not getting anything. Let's just put this together. And for me, my legislative experience actually came to fruition because of my union experience. Because when I got to the legislature, I said, hey, the people of Butte sent me here to do something. And if I can't figure out how to do it, why am I here? And that union experience, to be able to make friends on both sides of the aisles, and we can talk about all kinds of different stories of working with the other side of the aisle to benefit the community and the state of Montana. And it's in the, and what's this whole conversation about in labor? Just what Father Beretta said. Communication. If you're unwilling to communicate with somebody who thinks differently than you may not get him, but then you build a relationship. And I guess maybe could I have one story? Have I still got time? Or we
Yeah, you have a couple of minutes.
Okay, so one quick story of natural resources building at Tech. 2005, we came back, we had money in legislature. 2010, up in Tech, they wanted a natural resources building for like the last 15 years. George Dennison, who was another one of my non-favorites from Missoula, was in charge of Montana Tech. Chancellor Gilmer said, I can't tell you, but we'd like to get that building, but I don't mention this to you, don't say anything about 2005. We go, and I talked to a guy, a Republican, and I said, boy, this building, this natural resources building, they just keep cutting it. Dennison just kicks it back to the bottom, and the money goes to Missoula. So, how did I get it? A Republican got it because his nephew went to Montana Tech and had done. All of a sudden, Montana Tech building goes to the top of the bonding bill. Sue Dickinson from Great Falls accused me of doing that, and I had to say where I didn't do it, and I think I know who did. I mean, those are the relationship, just the communication with the person saying, we need this and it will be good. And he's saying, boy, my nephew's done real good, I'm going to help you do this. So, Father, I hope that kind of gets you where we need to get.
Yes, that was a great way to introduce this evening. Jim, a question. The 1917 great speculator tragedy, fire, did that introduce a period of truce in the labor conflict or more an intensification of the conflict?
Actually, the labor fire is kind of, it's still, the martial law was still going on after that. That was a culmination, it was still going on, but the labor issue there wasn't the issue. I think it brought the community closer because of tragedy. And I think you're talking about the 9/11. That was our 9/11 here for those people living at the time. And that tragedy changed the tone of the labor because it was too offsetting to have all those men and families just die. So I think it's kind of like 9/11. It brought the community back together. And you read the stories and what happened, it was a safety cable they were putting in to move a generator off the station. Why? To stop fires. And then the cable broke free and they went down because it was now junk and they went to take it out and carbide lights. And they go down with the carbide light and the light's on fire and they get the fire out. Well, now they still got to get the cable. They go back the second time with the carbide light to find the end of the cable, hook it up, and it goes on fire. And it just, that was it in the shop. The tragedy brought the community together to be just like you're talking about 9/11 and those things happened.
Wonderful to hear. One day, Dolores, you're going to have to tell me how we ended up in the Brewery Workers Union. Dr. Johnson, conflict in ideology.
Thank you very much. It's certainly a great honor to be here in Butte tonight, especially considering Carroll College's long-standing ties to Butte. Many generations of children from Butte have attended Carroll College, and many of them were children of miners, and it's the very first time they went to members of their family to go to college. So, one of the most important reasons why radicalization and polarization occurs in society is because of economic exploitation, too many people with heavy debts, and the psychological disappointment of feeling disrespected and disenfranchised. I'm going to focus my remarks this evening on two cases of Butte history involving upheaval and conflict. The first is the problems facing many of the miners early in Butte's history, and second, the less well-known and more diffusely spread, but also very important history of the exploitation of mortgages of all things, of which a lot more work still needs to be done. The early history of Montana and Butte, as we know, is dominated by what can be called the Anaconda Company and mining interest. Butte was a company, a union and company town, and the local government in the early 1900s was corrupt and often non-responsive to the needs of the citizenry. In 1911, a large number of homes were substandard, with overcrowding, poor ventilation, and no indoor plumbing. Tuberculosis and other contagious diseases were widespread. The city was dirty in many of the poorer areas, garbage was strewn around. Many of the miners died young, sometimes from accidents in the mines and sometimes from lung disease. Under this sort of dismal backdrop, workers in Butte and other parts of the country began rejecting politics as normal. They began rejecting both the Republicans and the Democrats and began turning to the Socialist Party. First, the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin elected a socialist mayor and a member of Congress. Then in 1911, a socialist mayor was elected in Butte named Lewis Duncan. He was a Unitarian minister, and he defeated both Republican and Democratic candidates running for office, which was not easy to do, and he was reelected again in 1913. The socialists in Butte acknowledged that what they achieved was not true socialism. What they achieved was a reformed government with a decidedly working class bent, including improvements in public health and some vacation for city maintenance workers that had long not existed before. Long term, of course, the Socialist Party did not turn to be the answer to the workers' problems. The experiment in socialist government ended in 1914. First, the Republicans and Democrats fused together to try to running the same candidate under both the Republican and Democratic parties to defeat the Socialists. That did not work. Then the Anaconda Company, violating long-standing practice, did not give the miners election day off. The Socialists still won re-election in 1913 and won some city council seats. What did do in the Socialists in Butte was the judicial system. A judge removed Duncan from office in 1914 for neglect of duties. Stating the mayor failed to provide the city with proper protection when a miners' union hall was blown up from dynamite. Probably that would not have happened to a Republican or Democratic mayor. More broadly, the Socialist Party receded in salience in power across the country. The highest number of votes a presidential candidate got under the socialist ticket was in 1912. The socialists themselves were divided between more revolutionary socialists and those who were more willing to work within the democratic system, democracy. And the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 further discredited socialism in the United States, and when women became enfranchised, they were less likely to vote socialist than men were. So, although socialism itself had passed as a major political movement in the West, socialists were still elected in New York City going forwards. Other institutions began to try to cater more directly to the needs of individuals, to workers and miners, including both Republicans and Democrats, who began absorbing some of the socialist policies into their own platforms. Other vital institutions included the Roman Catholic Church, very important in Butte. In 1891, Pope Leo XIII issued an encyclical, Rerum Novarum, in which he condemned the capitalists for their greed and gave the church's unequivocal support for workers to organize unions for their economic and social self-defense. But in the same encyclical, he also condemned the socialists for advocating class struggle, opposition to private property, and egalitarianism. Within the United States, the church placed more emphasis on criticizing socialism and less on promoting trade unions. There were many Irish Catholics in Butte, and priests in Butte at the time argued against the tenets of socialism. The tenets of socialism were inconsistent with Catholicism. However, the church was very active in trying to find alternative pathways to improve the lives of Montanans. One of them was the promotion of educational institutions. I found an article from the Helena Independent from 1920 when Bishop Carroll of Montana told the Rotary Club about the importance of a new college, Mount St. Charles College in Helena. He said Bishop Carroll emphasized the need for Christian educational institutions to fight against radicalism and other isms which are being expressed in Bolshevism, anarchism, and other un-American, unreligious movements in this country. That college became renamed as Carroll College later. The bottom line is socialism petered out as a political force. However, some of its ideas became incorporated in the major mainstream political parties and other institutions, ranging from churches and to local governments and local clubs and groups, became more responsive to the needs of the public, both big and small. The second thing I wanted to talk to you was about exploitative mortgages, which is less well known, but is very important as well. For thousands of years, religious leaders and others have protested against the practice of lenders excessively charging high rates of interest on debt, what we would call usury. Going all the way back to the 4th century, Basil of Caesarea and Ambrose of Milan delivered the most famous ancient homilies opposing usury, which carefully examined every biblical reference to money lending. The root cause of some of the largest catastrophes before the modern age involved essentially groups that were heavily in debt and eventually perpetuated violence. The Fourth Crusade, which ended up sacking Constantinople in 1204, and the destruction of the Aztec civilization and the destruction of Keane in 1521, all of them were because Cortez and the crusading groups were heavily in debt. They were heavily in debt and had no way out of what to do. In the 19th century, turning back to Montana and Butte, the radicalization happened again in the United States. If you read Mark Twain, if you read Charles Dickens, you'll see that they wrote negatively about the mortgage market in the Western land frenzies in the United States at the time. Investors from all over were looking to invest in the Western United States. Nonetheless, the shady and rickety mortgage land speculative markets persisted. International excitement about the prospects of financing Western land speculation grew in the 1860s and 70s. The early mortgage companies that originated these mortgages pulled them together and sold them to investors in the eastern United States and Europe. The fatal flaw was that the structures that neither the companies nor the market could survive mortgage defaults on a large scale. Thus, this market undermined public confidence in mortgages, and when it collapsed, an economic panic ensued. This same process would happen again in the 21st century. It was very, very similar to what we saw in the late 19th century, leading up to the mortgage crisis of 2008 and 2009. One company that entered the mortgage market in 1874, after demand for its principal product, life insurance, plunged, convinced farmers suffering from hard times to take out mortgages on the rationale that if the farmer died with the mortgage property, his destitute family would lose the farm. This was a cynical ploy, trapping Western farmers in the clutches of Eastern financial capital. So nonetheless, the pitch was effective. So farmers that moved west, seeking independence, found themselves still trapped. I read in one of these stories about how one German immigrant settled with his family in the West here, and he was just suffering from anxiety from the debt he owed from mortgage. So then he bought a life insurance policy. His son wrote he worried incessantly, was often found sitting in a chair, mumbling aloud to himself, counting figures and wondering if he would have enough cash on hand when the note would come due. Because if it didn't, he'd lose his farm and all his livelihood. He died a broken man in 1900, unable to cope with the fears instilled by financing debt. There's still a lot of work to be done on exactly what this looks like in Butte. There was a huge land grab, especially in Missoula. I found newspaper articles with the real estate barometers rising, Eastern investors plenty in the Montana mortgage market. But it too created radicalization, polarization, and discontent in society, because these markets always collapsed, and a lot of economic suffering ensued. One famous example, a number of Montana workers joined in 1894, was Coxey's Army of the Unemployed, which marched all the way from the west to the United States demanding federal relief for unemployed workers. That is, L. Frank Baum, the wonderful Wizard of Oz, is an allegory of all of that. You know, going the yellow brick road to Oz, which is Washington, D.C. The wizard is the President of the United States. All that is essentially be read as an allegory, the wonderful Wizard of Oz, just the suffering, the financial suffering in Montana and other Western states from this era. Fast forwarding to the 21st century, what happened between 2007 and 2009 was very similar to what happened in Montana and Butte, and has supercharged divisions and conflicts in society. People were plain disgusted in 2009. Some were furious with the banks, the rating agencies, others and other instruments of financial capital, others for pushing mortgages that could not be repaid. Other people were furious with decades of bipartisan alliances that seemed to support the growth and lack of regulation for such a short-sighted market to exist. Others were mad at the bailouts of the banks, and the line, your mortgage is not my problem, was the original rallying cry of the Tea Party. Others felt misled, could not find jobs. This was a very radicalizing moment in American politics. Certainly the old Republican Party changed a whole lot at that point in time. The Bush Republicans were no longer really in power of the party, and it led to a major shift within the Republican Party. It also led to major shifts within the Democratic Party, and it led to a sharpening of conflict. I do think there's a broader history here. It's that the economic exploitation, people mired in inescapable debts, feeling the unfairness has happened to them with unfulfilled expectations. This leads to polarization, it leads to anger. Some of the greatest tragedies in human history were precipitated in moments of such disillusionment. Perhaps the biggest tragedy of them all was that the Nazis under Hitler would never come to power, probably, if and thrown out the institutions of liberal democracy in Germany without the Treaty of Versailles being signed and all reparations and the angering and fury in Germany from that and the humiliation. So my research into all this, and again, more recently with the violence of January the 6th, most of the people who participated in that were individuals who were heavily in debt and had all sorts of personal problems and challenges. Taken with social isolation, too much social media, we face many challenges trying to reduce the severity of the conflict we see in today's society. We need to have empathy for people, understand where people are coming from, good faith efforts to sit and talk to others and not to be exploitative in any form. We need to support cultural enterprises, charities, and nonprofits that aim to enrich people's lives, share the happy and reflective moments as a community, families, and individuals. I suggest employers give workers regular pay raises and provide them with time off, health care, and retirement benefits. Any lending should be done at reasonable interest rates, and I'm dubious about some current practices involving debt collection and the ease of selling, the transaction of selling debt in society. I think we have a lot to learn from Butte's history and Montana's history about these supercharged conflicts. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Which of the two main parties benefited the most from the decline of socialism in Butte?
That's a very good question. So, so the reason that Montana became the state and the other western states, it was a partisan compromise. You know, Republicans were strong in some states, Democrats were strong in other states. So early in Montana's history, Republicans and Democrats sort of went back and forth in, who had the strength and who did not have the strength. After, by 1917, it just so happens that at the United States Senate level, Democrats held control of both U.S. Senate seats for just about a century, close to it. And so in some ways, long-term, the Democrats did better, maybe at the Senate level. Now, in terms of, eventually, of course, Democrats became more associated truly with labor. So I think the Democratic Party in Butte was a big beneficiary for that reason in Butte. In Montana, of course, for the governor's level, it went back and forth. The legislature went back and forth for many, many decades. Until the 1990s, Republicans and Democrats have a lot of parity. The number of votes in primaries and legislatures. Only in the last generation did the state sort of move away from being a purple state to more being a red state.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Clayton, conflict over land use, stream, and stream access, and then the environment.
Thank you, Father, and thank you to everyone for having me here. I would be remiss. As a lobbyist, I have learned a lot from Mr. Keane in the Capitol on good approaches, and I'm going to take a cue from him and recognize my partner as well. James is here. He works for Butte Silver Bowen. James was who helped get me involved in this group, and it's a great honor to be here tonight. So thanks, James. And appreciate the topic and the opportunity to talk a little bit about public lands. I'm going to start with my professional background. I work for Montana Trout Unlimited here in Montana, and I've worked in the Montana legislature for almost 15 years at this point for a number of groups, but the last 6 for Trout Unlimited. So I've had an opportunity to really see lens around issues related to water and stream access. And I certainly in our discussion would love to offer some of my observations from resolving conflict. I was just in a day-long negotiation around water policy, and we could have an entire night talking about conflict in water, but that isn't the topic for tonight. I'm excited to reach back a little bit into my academic background. Did my graduate work at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and specifically wrote my master's thesis on the Bureau of Land Management, the history and sort of organizational design theory around current practices. So it felt good to reach back and use some of that background knowledge of how public lands came to be. So I'm going to try to thread the needle a little bit and sort of help paint a picture of how we got here, a little bit of where I think you provided a unique experience and perspective in Montana's history around public lands, and specifically stream access, which is a unique political issue to other Western states, and then close out with a little bit of looking forward. And again, I appreciated Jim's sort of bookending 150 years, because it's pretty appropriate to the time frame I'm talking about too, really sort of Reconstruction, post-Civil War, forward to 2024. And in that context, I think public lands are often described, and I think Ken Burns, he was speaking specifically to the national parks, but I would say broadly, was speaking towards public lands as being a uniquely American idea, and perhaps America's best idea, the sort of democratic notion, the democratic notion of access to our public lands. But I wouldn't say that it was necessarily designed that way. In the beginning paradigm and framework in which the public landscape was created, particularly in the Western United States, wasn't with this idea that these would be a great democratic concept of which we would have open spaces where people could hunt and fish. Primarily, the notion of public lands was created by a new nation, and the concepts of manifest destiny and industrialization, and certainly the acquisition of new lands, and I would be remiss not to mention explicitly many would say the stealing of lands from Native people. But as we acquired this large estate in the West and sought to industrialize the nation with the product from it, what happened was sort of a move through that process in our concept and relationship to this public domain. Certainly in the late 1800s and early 1900s, both because of the sort of progressivism movement and sort of the institutionalization of science and scientific management, you saw some of this, but even before that, in the late 1800s, on March 1st, 1872, was the creation of the first national park in Yellowstone National Park in the world, which was for the first time where the country said we find a place so special and unique and so significant that we both want to set it aside for future generations, but we also want to make sure that what has happened in the east of Niagara Falls and some of those areas doesn't happen to a place like Yellowstone. So while particularly the state of California had created some small state parks, the creation of Yellowstone was a marked shift in relationship with the federal government with its public landscape and public domain. Shortly thereafter, as you saw, the creation of the U.S. Forest Service and the forest system, the forest reserves as they were first known. I will say also, just in terms of background, I'm very proud to be from Hart County, Wyoming, which is home to the first national park in the country, and also the first national forest in the country, the Shoshone National Forest, the original forest reserve. And many will remember the story of who became the first director of the U.S. Forest Service, and Theodore Roosevelt sitting on the floor in the Oval Office drawing lines on maps, creating these national forest reserves. With the concept, not that we were going to preserve and protect something, so in 1872 and sort of the beginning of the National Park Service, it was about creating something to protect it from the people. With the creation of the forest reserves and what would become the U.S. Forest Service, it was about this landscape as being beneficial for its use and development. I think that's an important shift. And with Gifford and Cho, who did go to the first, also created the first forestry school at Yale. I would say the Michigan Forestry School was the second forestry school, and the first one to adopt conservation, so there's a little bit of a rivalry there, but you saw the codification of scientific management beginning in that progressive era of science. What's notable, though, is that as the United States was creating these forest reserves for the protection of watersheds, for the development of timber, and at the same time had sort of a rapid policy of disposal of the large component of what was known as the public domain to incentivize the development of the West and the industrialization of the country. There were certainly a lot of lands left over, and it was many years that the federal government sort of struggled to figure out what it was going to do with these leftover lands. Ultimately, they became known in a contemporary sense as the Bureau of Land Management, when you saw the General Land Office merge with the Grazing Service. From there, you moved into the 1960s and 70s, and I think that was really the beginning of a market shift and a recognition of the public landscape being something that was of value in and of itself. Both at the federal level, passage of some very significant laws that changed the management and the direction of the public landscape, the Federal Land Policy Management Act, commonly known as the Organic Act of the Bureau of Land Management, also the Wilderness Act, the Wild and Scenic River Act, and the Multiple Use and Sustained Yield Act. So it was the beginning of this understanding that our public landscape did exist for a purpose, and it had a reason and a mandate both to produce and to provide value to communities, but also that the concept of multiple use, that you could have these multiple uses existing at once, and so the coexistence of that. I think it's important also to note in Montana at the same time in the 1960s and 70s, there was a lot of change happening here as well. With the Constitutional Convention in the early 1970s and the adoption of Montana's Constitution, I think you saw the concepts being explored at a federal level around concern of depletion of resources, of open space and public landscapes, and at the same time, the value of public lands in the context of providing revenue to communities codified in the Montana Constitution. Both in its preamble, and I know many of you have heard the preamble of Montana's Constitution, it's absolutely beautiful, and in Article 10 of the Constitution, codifying public lands and the value of the state trust lands for providing revenue to schools, and that's an issue that continues to go forward as we try to make sure that our state trust lands are providing maximum value to educate our children. From there, I'll briefly go through the 1980s and 2000s. I think the 80s and 90s were really the beginning of a period of intensifying conflict around public lands, and I think within that 50-year period, certainly there has always been conflict around public lands, but I think the intensification in the 1980s really came out of the Sagebrush Rebellion and the beginning of this wrestling with question of whether or not this public ownership, federal land ownership, was ever the intent of the sort of nature of those lands, or if they would be better managed by the states in this sort of more local control argument. Obviously, things got quite physical in the Sagebrush Rebellion, and it will come back to us here in a few decades later as well, even at the Montana Legislature. But the period of Sagebrush Rebellion, sort of the backlash of James Watt as Secretary of Interior, and some of the policies there, and then moving into the 1990s with the election of President Clinton and Bruce Babbitt being Secretary of Interior, really a 180-degree difference in philosophy of what the role of the Bureau of Land Management in particular, what the federal state was. And for the first time in the 90s, you saw more wilderness preservation advocates winning out, whereas the more development argued But it was an intense conflict between those two sort of entities. At the Montana level at that point, you also were seeing sort of rapid change, and this is going to lead me into where I see some of Butte's unique history in this, the 1980s and 90s and early 2000s. A lot of discussions in Montana about what the role of state trust lands were. Yes, they were of value to both generating interest and revenue to our school system, but they were also a large part of the landscape that we all love to hunt and fish on. And so the codification of the concept of multiple use, and specifically recreation as a benefit to the trust. And in this period, you saw the development and eventual codification of the Montana Stream Access Law, which I would describe as the best in the nation stream access law. And at the same time, the sort of last piece of that was the role of the state government in promoting and protecting landscapes that were important for the benefit of hunters and anglers, and the creation of the Habitat Montana program and other land acquisition programs within the state government to help promote and protect wildlife habitat and thereby access to hunting and fishing. I sit here in Butte, and part of why I was a little bit light on this Butte piece is that I moved to Butte in 2021, and I'm not going to try to pretend like I have anywhere of the richness of stories, personal stories that Mr. Keane has, and I've learned a lot from Jim and the stories he's told me and others, J.D. Lynch and others in my time in the legislature. But I think that Butte's relationship to public lands and this sort of story in the context of Montana is unique. Because for me, as I have both heard and met with and sat around and listened to many of the war stories of this sort of period of time, particularly in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, I think that you've had a unique relationship to the landscape. I'm really proud of living in a community of hardworking people, and that's always been a pride of Butte. And that what was unique about Butte from many of the places in the industrialized East is that we had access to some of the best hunting and fishing anywhere. And so it was a tremendous opportunity to have this reprieve from a hard-working week and work day to be able to go out and fish on the Big Hole River, of all places in the world, perhaps one of the best trout streams in the world. Go out and hunt and kill an elk and bring home food for your family, both in the sort of providing for, but access to opportunity for everyday blue-collar working people, I think is what makes Butte's relationship to this story very unique. And certainly today you see the product of that, and that spirit lives on in George Grant Trout Unlimited, the Anaconda Sportsman Association, Skyline Sportsmen, who are all incredibly active and play an outsized role, quite frankly, in the legislative debates that happen in Helena. Specifically, the story of stream access came out of Butte, and sort of the forefathers of Montana stream access law were champions of working class people here in Butte who wanted to make sure that every Montanan had a chance to be able to go out and float on a Saturday afternoon and catch a 20-inch Beretta trout. And so Tony Schunan and others were really champions in pioneering this concept that you shouldn't, that rich, wealthy out-of-staters shouldn't be able to come in and buy out the river and block my access as a working class Montanan from these places. So through that product, and I'm not going to get into the case law specifics, but a series of sort of Montana Supreme Court decisions led to what we know today as Montana Stream Access Law that was later codified by the Montana Legislature in statute Title 23. But I'll just end with a bit of an anecdote on that point. When I started my career, a very good friend of mine carried a bill. He was a state representative at the time from Dillon that would arguably have harmed significantly Montana stream access law by changing the definition of a ditch. Many people, including Mr. Schunan and many busloads of Butte residents showed up to the Capitol in 2009 to oppose that bill and filled the rafters wearing their waders. The bill went down. Fast forward, we went through a relatively quiet period to 2024, and there was another bill Senate Bill 497 that would have arguably damaged the stream access law as well. Not only did that bill die on the floor of the state Senate 14-36, it was that same legislator, Republican legislator from Butte, who stood up and was from Dillon, excuse me, Republican legislator from Dillon, who stood up and led the opposition on the floor of the Senate to kill that bill. So not only did Butte's story and sort of the story of Southwest Montana, I think, codify and protect for many generations public land access, stream access in particular. I think that what it has done is move it to the third rail of Montana politics, public lands and stream access. We're all inundated with political ads these days, and how many times in a day you will hear keep public lands in public hands is truly remarkable. And it was just really 10 years ago where we were fighting those sort of zombie sagebrush rebellion ideas in the Montana legislature to transfer lands back to the states. So I think that the United States story with public lands, I think, is unique. It is necessarily riddled with conflict. There is and will always be conflict around the idea, the purpose, the role, the mission of our public land agencies and how we use those. And part of that is the other side of that coin being that what makes public lands so unique and such a strong and salient issue is that I think every person in this room has a different relationship with what the phrase public lands mean. And so for me, it's sitting in my drift boat and casting a dry fly on the big hole, and for somebody else, it could be camping with their grandkids in what I might find a pretty busy and crowded place. It can be wilderness advocates and it can be city parks. It's a great unifying thing because it means so many issues. But to say that there won't be conflict around these issues is naive, and there will and always will be, and I look forward to talking more about some of the lessons of navigating that conflict.
Thank you, Clayton. Very briefly, you say that we have the best stream access in the entire country. I'm very proud of this. Who deserves the most credit for this?
I would say, and Mr. Keane would probably be able to, he was around for many of these fights before my time, but Tony Schunan is probably the father of Montana stream access law and the pioneer.
So we're going to take a 3 minutes break. Restrooms are downstairs, and then when we come back, we're going to go into some depth about how do we get people to talk to each other and start listening to each other when they have just very dramatically opposing views. We're going to start with that and then have a conversation with all of them. Take a 3 minutes break.